Me. Okay, so today we're gonna talk with terrorist, black magician, and anarchist Cameron Wilder. We're gonna discuss his arrest, his philosophical views, and occult and mystical experience. Cameron, welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. So, can you tell us something about you, who you are, and what are your personal beliefs which forced you to go through this semi antinomian path?
Yeah, it's funny. I've been many things. When people ask me who I am, what I am, it's hard to answer because I've been many things throughout my life. And that, of course, has been part of the path I walk. One of the labels that this path is called traditional Satanism, and it's practiced by groups like the Black Order out of New Zealand, and most notoriety, the Order of Nine Angles, which of course has sects all over the world. And so, really, the essence of this practice and this philosophy is that true occult wisdom is only found on the true left-hand path. And the essential idea of this true left-hand path is that the fringes and the taboo and the true dark side and forbidden aspects of things is where knowledge and wisdom is to be found. So if we are to find occult enlightenment, it can only be found in those places that are strictly forbidden from a societal perspective, especially from the perspective of moral absolutes. And so one of the ways that the particular tradition that I follow espouses and recommends to find this wisdom is to pursue something called an insight role, where essentially you adopt a persona that is pretty much the polar opposite of what is considered conventionally acceptable from a social perspective, and it should also be something that contradicts your values internally. And back then I was still somewhat of a compassionate person, a little bit of a Marxist, and so I joined a radical group called the Atomwaffen Division, which is a neo-Nazi terrorist organization, just to put it in plain English. And this, of course, was to pursue enlightenment by confronting and adopting and becoming something that was forbidden in the extreme. Because, of course, the forbidden in the true doctrine of the left-hand path, the forbidden and the taboo is where wisdom is to be found. So ultimately,
Okay, so can you explain us for a second, because a lot of the viewers are kind of not necessarily familiar with all of the concepts you are introducing.
Yeah.
What is, in your opinion, a left-hand path as a philosophy, and how it encourages people to engage in controversial activities such as terrorism, illegal activity, etc.?
Yeah. So to understand like the left-hand path, you kind of have to understand the right-hand path, right? And so I like to think of it because often people think of the left-hand path and the right-hand path in the traditional terms of good and evil, right? But that is from a paradigm of moral absolutes. When the Christians took over society, they started categorizing things as good or evil. And so people think of the left-hand path as evil and the right-hand path as good. But really, there's just a couple distinctions to be drawn outside of the paradigm of moral absolutes. And what it really comes down to is that the right-hand path has moral and ethical restrictions, such as the golden rule is like the epitome of the right-hand path. Do as to others as you would have done unto you, right? Egalitarianism, being a good person, that's essentially the right-hand path. Don't hurt people, right? Or try not to anyway. And then the left-hand path just disregards that. It's total freedom. So the paradigm of moral absolutes has no bearing on left-hand path practice. It's harming people is okay. You don't have to, but essentially all those moral restrictions that you find in the right-hand path, such as not harming people, be a good person, be generous, put others before you, the left-hand path, in my perspective and opinion and understanding, disregards all of that and is simply do as you will. Whatever it is you want, do it. There are no limits, there are no restrictions. Morals are imaginary. And then another, I guess, interesting one that I've been pondering recently is that the right-hand path seeks to sort of escape physical sensation. They think things such as pleasure and pain, life is suffering, the physical world is bad, escape from it. The left-hand path also thinks, and again, in my experience, intensity. Pleasure and pain are good. The physical world is a way to actually achieve enlightenment, and therefore do not try and escape it. Do not try and escape the bondage of samsara, as the Hindus and the Buddhists would have you say. It's a good thing. Pain and pleasure, the physical world. Enlightenment can be found in extreme experience and not just escaping it, if that makes sense. That's my understanding anyway.
Okay, so basically, for those among the audience who doesn't know, you were basically incarcerated for joining a terrorist group in order to, as you say, expand your spiritual evolution. So can you, like, from a basic standpoint, tell us how it happened, which group you joined, what you did inside of a group, how you interacted with people in the group, and what are the goals of the group, basically?
Yeah, of course. So the nature of the group is it was a group of the far right. They could be called neo-fascists, but the most obvious association is neo-Nazi, right? They were essentially a group of esoteric Hitlerists, and they were also, these people were very involved in the occult. They believed that Hitler was an avatar of Vishnu in Hinduism, and that we should try and create another Hitler in the form of Kalki the Destroyer, right? But
Okay,
that's
so
all very
basically they deified Hitler, but what they tried to do in the physical world, were there any shootings, terrorist attacks, bombings, etc.? Like,
yeah.
what the fuck were you guys trying to do on a physical level, you know?
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually integral to the belief. They were an accelerationist organization. So they wanted to contribute to the collapse of Western civilization and reset everything to zero, cause chaos. So that way they could build the Fourth Reich out of the ashes, right? So anything, really anything. It could be, you know, as you said, terrorist attacks. It could be propaganda that would inflame the dissonance in modern society. Anything that pushed Western civilization in the direction of collapse was the goal of this organization.
Okay,
Very
so
much so.
basically, did they organize bombings or shootings or murder? Like, what were actually they trying to do, like, as a physical action?
So I can't speak for others, right? Because I wasn't involved in any of that stuff. It was very much a, how do you say it? Horizontal collectivist, if you will, leaderless resistance. So basically, every cell of this organization was allowed to do whatever they wanted. There were murders. There were definitely murders. There were planned attacks. The leader of the organization, Brandon Russell, they found a homemade bomb in his garage. He was once part of the National Guard. They theorized that he was going to use it to take out the electrical grid of the United States. You know, he had a framed picture of Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, in his room. And so, you know, there were a lot of things like that that happened all over the world in association with this group. Now, they never actually, as far as I know, successfully carried out any of that stuff because they were always arrested before it happened. But that just kind of shows you like the strain of this kind of person. That was all
Okay.
stuff that they celebrated and encouraged.
So for the sake of the audience, I kind of need to elaborate because a lot of people kind of don't comprehend what the guy was trying to do. So he was trying to blow up the aspects of the electric grid. Now, American electric grid is famous for being not necessarily the safest electric grid ever. And so if you blow up even the small station in the electric grid, you are basically leaving tens of thousands of people without electricity. And they are made in such a way that they are extremely difficult to fix. So if he blew up one aspect of the electric grid, that will basically force hundreds of thousands of people possibly to drown in their own shit for months. So
Yeah.
that's not benign at all. This was actually extremely well planned terrorist attack, because American electric grid is one of the weakest electric grids as far as safety is concerned. So can you elaborate how were you related to that organization and what were you actually doing? To the
Yeah.
capacity you can tell us, of course.
Yeah. So I was a leader in it. So the command structure was sort of in the way that each chapter all over the country of the United States had their own leaders. And then those leaders were part of a greater sort of like council, if you will. And then that council would answer to like 5 people at the top who were in charge of basically running the website, running the propaganda, vetting new prospects. I was in that top 5, and my specific job was to recruit and vet people to make sure they weren't infiltrators, to make sure they weren't cops or federal informants. That was my job. I was pretty much there at the top with them.
Okay, but as far as I understand from our previous correspondence, you were trying to infiltrate them or troll them the entire time. So basically, what was like your goal? How were you like trying to infiltrate them or troll them or subterfuge them in a way?
Yeah. So essentially, this group, because of the nature of it, there were a lot of other people who were a part of my occult tradition within this group, right? And so I came across these people totally by coincidence. It's like, oh shit, you're part of this traditional Satanist vein as well, right? And so, really, this was also a way for me to sort of handpick people that had potential for the left-hand path of occultism, and then sort of take them under my wing personally and show them the way outside of this terrorist organization, if you will.
Okay, so
So,
what were you essentially trying is you are pretending to work for the organization, while in reality you were trying to convince the people indirectly to leave the organization in order to further their own development in different direction. So
exactly.
basically, can you tell us what were you actually doing in that organization? Like, what were you doing to people? What were you engaging in? How you recruited those people? You know, how it really operated.
Well, really, as a primary recruiter, and that's pretty much the most of what I was involved in was as a recruiter. Is I would go to places where I thought that people who were susceptible to our propaganda would congregate. So I often found that ex-drug addicts were actually the most radical. So I would go to places like Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous. I would find people that seemed to have a very radical right-wing sort of vein, and I would just like feed them crumbs, get them talking about their views on society. And it would have to be a very specific kind of person, because it would have to be someone who's very misanthropic, who views that society and Western civilization, there's no saving it. There's absolutely no hope. So I would go to places where the hopeless were, and I would give them a purpose in the form of this group and organization and its mission. And then if they continued to show potential, I would kind of pull them out and be like, hey, like, I think you would be better suited for this left-hand path way of life. And of course, like, it's a sort of contradictory, right? Because the left-hand path is very much against joining collectivist ideologies, which is what this organization essentially was. It was a collectivist ideology. There were dogmas you had to adhere to, one of which is actually contradictory because I'm not even full white. I'm half Chinese, right? But it was funny because as I was in this group, I would kind of be working against the ideology in a way. While I'm recruiting for it, I'm also recruiting for myself to find people who would fit into this occult niche that I was a part of and still am.
Okay. So basically, I want to like explain to people what was going on here. So you infiltrated like a neo-Nazi group with occult elements, and then you kind of rose up through the ranks of that neo-Nazi group, and then you recruited people to join into the group, and then secretly you indoctrinated people you recruited against the group so they can leave the group or work against the group from the inside. And so, can you like tell us what was actually the end result of that? How it all ended, where it all led to.
Yeah. So it led to a lot of people in the neo-Nazi group getting exposed. There was an infiltration by a journalist, and this journalist ended up finding out the identities because the whole group, of course, this is very risky work that we were doing. None of us knew each other's real names at all, period, right? We all used pseudonyms. And so a journalist infiltrated the group, and they were able to find out the identities of some of the key leaders in the organization, and then those identities got released to the public. There was a huge media backlash. And so then what happened is one of my cohorts in the group, who was a very personal friend of mine and he was local, he got put on the news, local news a lot, and international news. And then what ended up happening is the Seattle Police Department issued a red flag gun confiscation warrant because of his belonging to this group, and they confiscated his guns and his firearms. And so there was a huge political scandal about this. People thought it was against the Constitution. Some people supported it. In the group, we were pissed because it's like, how the hell did they find out who we are, right? They never found out who I was, but they found out who a lot of these other people were. And so they essentially went on the run. And after that, we sort of planned a revenge and intimidation campaign against the media. We identified the most prominent and vocal critics and journalists of our organization, and then we sent them anonymous threats through the mail. And then it turned out that there was an undercover informant and FBI agent inside the group the whole time, and they arrested us all on that basis. And that's how I ended up doing 3 years in federal prison for it, because I was directly involved in that campaign to intimidate the journalists into silence. And so then
Okay.
I did 3 years in prison for that. And then the group sort of dissolved because literally everybody got arrested. So, so it's gone.
Yeah, but basically, you were in the group and you participated in illegal activities, but you were also working against the group the entire time. So
Yeah.
basically, can you tell us like the craziest plans we had and the craziest things you did in that group? What is like the most intense stuff you ever participated in during those illegal years of yours?
Yeah.
Your years on the other side of the law. What was like the most dangerous activity you engaged in?
Yeah. So there was a lot of propaganda of the deed. You know what I mean? So really, the most dangerous things that we would do, that I personally did, is during these there were riots every year in Seattle on May 1st, May Day, which is International Workers' Day. There's a lot of protests, and if anyone watches the news, they know that more often than not on May Day there are a lot of riots. You know what I mean? Because these anarchists will kind of come out of the woodwork, and at night they'll like light stuff on fire, they'll break things, they'll start riots. I wasn't part of the rioting personally, but I infiltrated the anarchist sect and was kind of like studying them. And so then what happened, and I was also handing out Atomwaffen flyers, right? Sort of propaganda. And so what happened is they found out that these neo-Nazi propaganda were being passed out during this riot. And then the anarchists sort of like found out that it was me specifically. And so they kind of like chased me out of town, and I kind of had to like run for my life because it seems like rioters were just coming after me, and it was only me. Like, it was only me there. I didn't bring any of my comrades with me. And so, yeah, and they wanted to physically harm me. Like, they were probably going to beat the shit out of me. I don't want to think they would have killed me, but I definitely think they would have harmed me very significantly if they had caught me. So, you know, I had to run for my life through Pioneer Square in Seattle to escape these people. And I was doing it, of course, to inflame the sort of political dissonance. You know, I didn't participate in the rioting directly. I didn't damage any property, but I was sort of inflaming the political dissonance between the right-wing protesters and the left-wing protesters, sort of like, you know, getting them pissed at each other. And then they ended up trying to attack me, physically harm me. It was pretty crazy, just by handing out flyers. So that was intense. Just like running from this angry mob of people. Of course, I knew the cops wouldn't be able to save me because, like, obviously it was a riot. There was almost no police presence in this part of the area. So that was pretty scary. That was definitely very intense.
So yeah, that's interesting. So you were basically being a propagandist for that neo-Nazi group, and you also claim that you secretly worked against the group. So can you tell us about your time in prison? You know, what you did in prison,
So that's
how your life went.
yeah. So prison. Now, prison was really spiritually significant to me because obviously I believe that struggle, suffering, and pain is a way to evolve, to become stronger. You know what I mean? I think pain and suffering is probably the best way to become spiritually strong, to gain wisdom, in other words, right? Pathemathos. But no, in prison, it was really intense. I was in federal prison on the West Coast, so everything was really racially segregated. Not only was it racially segregated, but there were also politics. So prisoners have their own sort of code of conduct. You know, there's two things you can't be, which are sex offenders and snitches. I was neither, so I was safe. I was all right. I didn't really have to worry about that. But what it comes down to in prison is that everything is based on violence and it's implicit. So they have these rules. Like, for example, you cannot walk between the tables of where another race sits because there's 4 groups of tables where the 4 different races sit: the whites, the paisas, which are the Mexicans, the Asian, Native, Pacific Islanders are all in one group, and then there's the blacks, right? And you essentially cannot walk between their tables. You have to walk around them from where they sit and eat. And then that's a rule, right? But the obviously unspoken part of the rule is if you break any of these rules, they're going to hurt you. And it's either going to be you're going to get beat up, you're going to get stabbed. Like, who fucking knows? You know, there was never any sexual assault, like, because since sex offenders were looked down upon in the federal prison system, there was never any like rape in prison. I'd never even heard of that happening, never seen it. But there was stuff that was just as bad. Obviously, getting cut with like a razor blade is very bad. And there was always sort of like an implicit threat of violence behind every little thing. You know, it's very militant. Workouts are mandatory. You have to be working out or else, you know, you're going to look bad, and it all reflects on your race. So if you do something bad, you're not working out, you're using too many drugs, you're acting like a fucking idiot, the rest of your race is going to hold you accountable, and they might cut you, kick your ass, who knows, right? But it was like a very much sort of like militant atmosphere in every way. And because of the nature of my crime, I obviously hung out with the white people, and the white supremacist guys in prison were very much serious. You know, one of the heads of this neo-Nazi prison gang, the 1488s, he was my cellmate. His name was Filthy Führer, and the whites of his eyes were tattooed black like a demon. He did most of the tattoo work on my arm that's on my sleeve to this day. But he sort of like gave me the rundown of how prison works, especially if you're running with the white boys. And I can honestly say that like his advice saved my life. And so, no, it was extremely violent. There was violence almost every day. Every day. It was commonplace, whether it was another inmate getting beat up, whether it was a cop getting beat up. It was extremely violent. And it was instant. There was no yelling. If violence happened, there was no yelling. There was no talking beforehand. It was just instant and senseless and quick. It was unlike anywhere I've ever been. It's a whole other world in there. So, yeah.
Interesting. So basically, you were hanging out with all of those people from the other side of the law, and you kind of had to be really careful because you were in prison and there is no enough protection in prison, and it's kind of wild west there, which I heard from a lot of ex-prisoners I talked to. But can you like tell us how you practiced your occult practices in prison, and did your occult beliefs have anything to do with your incarceration? How is that kind of related in a direct sense?
Yeah,
If you can
for
say
sure.
it, you know.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously, in this tradition that I follow, the sinister tradition, traditional Satanism, Order of Nine Angles, whatever you want to call it basically, because at the beginning stages, which is where I was, you're gonna have to do a lot of shit, and not every insight, and I need to make this clear, not every insight role is illegal. You can choose to be a vagabond, you can choose to travel, you can choose to infiltrate a Buddhist sect. Like, not all of them have to be illegal. But essentially, it's understood that the most dangerous and the most risky ones are the ones that, impose the most enlightenment and the most wisdom by their nature. Because the more danger, the more struggle, the more suffering, the more wisdom that comes from it, right? And so obviously, the only reason I ever joined this organization was because of the insight role of my occult tradition. And so obviously, this is just a depiction of one of the risks. Like, if you're going to pursue a very serious and dangerous insight role, one of the risks is incarceration. One of the risks is injury. Like, that just comes with the territory. And so I continued to practice my occult practice in prison. I did tarot readings for people in prison as one of my hustles. I actually made money from that. I don't know who to this day, but someone anonymously sent me the literature associated with my tradition while I was in prison. And I still have those books to this day. So I was able to continue my practice while I was in prison. And I was also in correspondence with other associates, and they sort of told me and taught me and showed me the way of how I can incorporate this incredibly dangerous and negative life experience into my overall occult development, which is, of course, pathemathos, wisdom through pain, wisdom through suffering. And so, that's sort of like the mindset that allowed me to get through it as well as I did, is that there were periods where I was so hungry that my stomach hurt and I felt like I was going to puke. There were periods where I would get in a fight or get assaulted, and I would spend time in solitary confinement, sometimes for hundreds of days with like no human contact whatsoever, or books at all even. Sometimes I wouldn't even let you have books in solitary. So I would have to really sort of learn how to meditate really well and visualize out of necessity, or else I would go insane within this specific type of experience. So I was really able to just like indulge in this sort of occult practice in the purest sense, because there was nothing else to do. It's either that or go insane from the boredom. So it really did sort of compound and purify me, if you will. Because I also had a dream while I was in there where I encountered an entity, and it became very clear to me that no, like, this is the point of my life. This is what I'm here to do, is to pursue the occult, is to pursue the left-hand path, no matter where it goes. And there will be risk, pain, and loss.
So I want to like ask you something which is really interesting. So you claim that you were in solitary confinement for hundreds of days. So can you tell us, like, after first month or two, when your mind starts to basically go into trance spontaneously because of the confinement, what do you actually see? How it actually works after your mind kind of goes crazy from the confinement and you start to go into those spiritual states and kind of hallucinate? How it kind of goes?
Yeah. So time starts to become irrelevant because there's no clocks, right? You're basically in a room where there's no visible light from the outside. There's no way to tell time unless you get your meals, right? But even then, it all starts to kind of blur together. The days, right? You start losing track of how many days it's been. I stopped counting whether it was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. None of that mattered because you're just in there for so long, right? With nothing, no books, no pencils, no drawing, nothing. And so the first 2 months are the hardest because that's when your mind is adapting to the sensory deprivation, because that's what it is. There is no stimulation whatsoever. At first you kind of start like, and this is going to sound funny, but you start kind of like looking at the walls, you start noticing the cracks in the concrete and like between the seams, and you just do anything to like stimulate your mind. And then there's only so much around you. You're in a room that's empty. So there's only so much you can look at before you've already seen all of it. So then once you reach that point, after the first month or two, then that's when you start to hallucinate. And like hallucinate you will. You start to hear things. You start to see things. Like I've heard of people seeing bugs that aren't there. I would hear voices more often than not. Like I would hear things talking to me about my life. There were some voices that were very cruel. Like they would like point out my inadequacies. They would say shit like no one loves you or cares about you and you're gonna die and you're forgotten by everybody and your life's gonna mean nothing, right? And so it was very hard to sort of maintain sanity, if you will. So at some point I did consider suicide while I was in there a couple times after a long time, like because after 90 days it's like you just start to lose your bearings, you just start to lose your grip. And so I hit a rock bottom at one point, and so to escape I sort of just started doing visualization meditations, I guess, are what you could call them, where I would just sit in a pose or lay down in bed and I would just start to visualize. And I would like visualize myself in places that weren't the cell I was in. And the visualizations would get so deep that I would be able to feel things. I would be able to taste things and hear things. Like I wasn't even in that cell anymore. You know what I mean? And I would visit these, some of them were places I've been, like, my grandparents' house where I grew up, or my hometown or my old workplace. And then some of these places would be like obviously not real. Like I remember this one time I was in this vast sort of like wasteland. It almost looked like the surface of Mars. It was just like red sand. It was cold, it was dark, and it was very strange. And there was like a massive like black pyramid made out of like shiny stone in this like vast landscape. And it was weird because these like images in these places that I would go to when I would do these visualizations were places that I had never seen before. And so it almost felt like it was coming from somewhere else. And I would encounter like entities and like beings, you know what I mean? And after I started studying Carl Jung and his works, which I also studied while I was in prison, I encountered some of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, particularly my anima, my female counterpart of my personality, the archetype. But I would also encounter other things that weren't as easily explained by the archetype. So that really sort of compounded and reinforced my spiritual views with these entities that I would encounter during these meditations. Yeah, it was crazy.
Okay. Basically, can you tell us your craziest experience in solitary confinement? What is like the craziest, most out of the blue happening you had?
Yeah. So I remember I So I remember I fucking was in this realm, right? It was a dark forest and it was very foggy. This was during one of these visualization meditations. And I saw this figure out in this clearing in the woods. It was dark. It must have been nighttime. So it was dark and it was in the woods. It was very foggy. And I came across this clearing when I was in the woods. And this was all, of course, in solitary confinement. I'm doing one of my visualizations, right? And I come across this female entity that was in this clearing in the woods, and she says she speaks in a language that I'm not sure what it was. It didn't sound like English, but she was speaking in a language I didn't understand. But she had this like sort of like stone in front of her that had like hieroglyphic inscriptions, and then it had a number on it, and I believe, and if I remember correctly, the number was like 68213, right? And I'm just like, what does that have to do with anything? 68213, right? What the fuck does that have to do with anything? And so then, I'm interrupted from my visualization. It's lunchtime. I get my lunch on the tray, and the cereal, because the sandwiches come in like pre-packaged sort of like styrofoam containers with serial numbers on them, and the package on the sandwich literally had that fucking number 68123, and I'm just like, are you fucking kidding me right now? What the fuck does that even mean? So no, like I started noticing weird little synchronicities that would come from my visualizations, and then just seemingly like unimportant things that would, find their way into my life while I was in solitary, whether it be my mail, whether it be fucking random little numbers that I would notice on like the food or the commissary that they would give me. Like there just started being weird little synchronicities at the point where I was like, because at that point I kind of was almost skeptical about like precognitive abilities, like seeing the future or whatever. But then like at that point I was just kind of like, okay, like I think there's more to consciousness than we know, especially with the weird little synchronicities that I encounter on my visualizations that would correlate with things that would happen. And it was also interesting because on my final visualization before I got out of solitary, I saw this guy. I envisioned myself coming back to the normal housing unit out of solitary, and I saw this guy with a fucking mohawk and the fucking in the Sawilo rune right here on his face. And I'm just like, okay, that's kind of interesting. And lo and behold, as soon as I get out of solitary, a guy with a fucking mohawk with a Sawilo tattoo right here come up and talk to me and be like, hey, white boy, welcome to the unit. Like, my name is such and such. And I was just like, holy shit. Like, I literally saw that happen before it happened. And so that was pretty fucking crazy. Like, I started just seeing things, and a couple times I think I saw the future. And so it was pretty intense. Honestly, it was pretty intense.
Okay. So what is like basically, because when you are in solitary confinement and you go into those alternative states of mind, it doesn't happen all at once. It kind of goes in stages, right? So can you like describe for people who are not basically into this shit how it kind of goes, how it kind of starts, what are kind of the levels of that, and how it culminates?
Yeah. So it's kind of like diving in water, right? You're sort of just like plunging deeper and deeper and deeper into the water. And of course, water is like a common way to describe the unconscious, dark, murky water. And that's very much what it felt like. So how I would start is I would get in either my pose or laying down in my bed, and I would just focus on my breathing. You know what I mean? In, hold for a couple seconds, out for a couple seconds. And I don't know how long it would last because, again, I would lose track of time. There's really no way to tell how long things last when you're in there. And so I would just do that for however long it took. I want to say like maybe like 20 to 30 minutes. You rhythmically time and count your breaths until it becomes unconscious, right? And that sort of rhythm of your breathing is what puts you into the state, right? It's almost like a self-hypnosis, if you will. You're hypnotizing yourself, is I guess the best way to describe it, through your rhythmic breathing. And so then you kind of like lose track of what's like going on, you lose track of time. And at some point, and of course your eyes are closed, and at some point you start to feel like you're spinning, right? I remember when that first happened. That was really intense, and it was almost nauseating. I almost felt like I was going to fly off my bed. Like the sensation was so intense. I felt like I was spinning really, really fast, and then it started feeling like I was falling. After the spinning would happen for a long period of time, the falling would happen. And then the falling would start out really fast, like I'm sort of free falling. And again, like in actuality, I'm just laying there in bed with my eyes closed, rhythmically breathing. But the spinning would happen, and then I would feel like I'm falling really, really, really fast. Like so fast, it almost like hurts, right? Then it would start to kind of like slow down. And after it would slow down, it would start to feel like heavy. Like I would almost feel like a weight like on my body, as if I was like submerged really deep underwater. And I would sort of like feel this like heavy sort of like liquid sensation on me. Like I said, as if you're floating under deep water, right? And so then at that point, you start to see like colors, I guess is the best way I would describe it. You know, like in your vision, you would start to see like flashing colors, sort of like blue, orange, yellow. And then I would start to see like a candle flame, I guess is like the best way to describe it. There would be like a flame, and it would be very clear, like crystal clear, as if it was right in front of me and I could reach out and touch it. There would be a candle flame that would flicker and flicker and flicker. And then as I would like focus on that flame, that's when I would find myself literally pulled into whatever realm that I was going to. Most of the time, I didn't intentionally visualize anything. I would just kind of let my mind do whatever the hell it's doing. And, you know, I would feel this like indescribable pull, like I'm getting literally pulled into this like candle flame sort of deal. And then I would be wherever I was. You know what I mean? Whatever this place would be, whether it was the woods, whether it was back home, whether it was that ethereal landscape that looked like fucking Mars, like wherever the hell it was, I would just all of a sudden be there. And it was vivid. Sometimes I would go to places I can't even describe. Like if you've ever done like DMT or like any sort of psychedelic and have like an out of body experience, and you're in these sort of like ethereal realms that look like they're made out of like geometric shapes that look like they're also mechanical but biological at the same time, like almost like Lovecraftian in essence, you know, like just things I can't even put into words. Like you would just end up there, like suddenly after the falling and the spinning and the lights and the candle flame. So no, that's the exact progression that it would normally take. And it was interesting. I was wondering if this was something I shared, if this was like a normal experience. Someone who was very close to me sent me this book by Julius Evola called Introduction to Magic. And in it, it describes like a Tibetan death meditation. And it's exactly that. And I was like, holy shit. So this is actually a thing, right? Like I'm not the only person who's experienced this. And same thing, the spinning, the falling, the flame, the colors, that's all stuff that apparently people would see during this specific meditation. So, you know, if people are interested in reading more about that, I would recommend that book, Introduction to Magic by Julius Evola. But there's very much a progression where you feel yourself falling, and then you plunge into the depths of the collective unconscious. It's a very sensual experience, you know, it's not just visualizing it. If you go deep enough, you actually feel it. So it was pretty crazy. Very crazy.
Okay, so basically you managed to use your solitary confinement in order to teach yourself to reach deeper trances and have more profound spiritual experience. And that entire engagement in terrorist action basically allowed you to commit a lot of dubious things, but also to develop your consciousness in a really interesting way. So
Exactly.
I would ask you one thing, right? So basically, I noticed that once I go out of that sensory deprivation area, whatever that is, even the forest in different occasions can be sensory deprivation, because,
Yes.
once you go out of that state where you are basically alone for extreme amounts of time, it's really difficult to achieve the same level of basically depth when you are around society. So, can you tell us how did you manage, if ever, to achieve the similar depth in society?
Yeah, and actually, thank you for asking that because I was actually going to say something about that. So and this is something I feel kind of like upset about, is that I haven't been able to replicate that sort of depth of trance out here at all. Like, and it almost seems like, these conditions of sensory deprivation and confinement are like necessary to reach that state, right? Long periods of it. And so I will say, though, the closest that I have ever gotten to getting there to that depth of trance again are, like you said, where I'm socially isolated. So if I go camping for like a couple weeks or a month and I deprive myself of human interaction and contact, and I think that's the most important part, is like getting away from other people who can like influence your state of mind, so there's nothing to distract you from just yourself. I feel like those are the best conditions to replicate that sort of the environment necessary for this level of trance. You definitely have to get away from technology. You have to get away from people. You have to get away from things that stimulate your physical senses. Because the more you deprive yourself of the stimulation, the better. And the longer beforehand, too. I just read this article about this gentleman who was a Buddhist, and he did a 90-day self-isolation in a cabin in the woods for meditation. And he came to a similar conclusion that you have to really sort of deprive yourself of sensory stimulation, especially in the form of other people and technology, to reach a state beforehand before you enter this like trance, if you will.
So basically, because we are kind of on the same page, I want to share something with you, which is, interesting, and also with the audience. So, what I tend to do basically on a daily basis is this is kind of dangerous, but this works for me better than like any fancy stuff I read somewhere. So, you basically go into the woods and you just, for a really long time, you pick a tree and you basically scry into a tree. You look into a tree as if you would look into a candle or a seal or a sigil. Basically, you look into a tree for a really long time and you are just focused on a tree. You just like look into a tree. And then what will happen after a while? This is like weird,
Yeah.
but what will happen is like tree will start to vibrate. And then after the tree vibrates, you start hearing musical notes. And it's always like a weird, repetitive musical notes, like a pipe or something, but it's like a really archaic note. And then the tree will basically become alive, and something really monstrous and archaic and primal will come out of a tree. Basically,
Holy shit.
whatever is the consciousness of a tree, it will come out. And you basically talk to that. And you have like the craziest psychedelic experience you can. I mean, after doing this for like 2 or 3 years, relatively often, I took LSD, like a really heavy dose, like 6 doses at once, and I saw nothing new. Like it was almost a little bit intense version of what I was doing every day. So I would like, when you do this weird shit, you see like colors, flashes of light, balls of light. Your body is buzzing. You hear musical notes. Like it's almost like when you take some hallucinogenic, but this is you're just
Yeah,
like sit in front of a tree and you scry into a tree and you look at nothing else. Like you
yeah.
just look at one single tree for a really long time, and the tree will basically open up the gate into whatever that realm is.
Wow.
Now, what I found, so there are like many parallels uh, in what I'm doing or what I was doing and what you are describing. So how my entire like self exploration started, basically, because of the circumstances I was in, I would like be alone for a really long time. I would just like be in a room for extremely long periods of time in a single room. I'm not gonna go into why, but let's say I
Yeah.
was. And one day I was just like looking, and from the corner of the room I was in, black shadow came, like a 3D black shadow figure, and it like started screaming at me. It started like telling he's gonna kill me. It started like, and I would hear a voice inside of my head 24/7. And
Mhm.
then after a while, through different practices, I found a way to get rid of that. And this is basically how my practice started. But there are basically many parallels between what you are describing and what I'm kind of going through, not necessarily now to this intensity because it fluctuates, but we are kind of on the same page here.
Yes.
And I kind of understand like the point of your entire journey. So the point of your journey was not necessarily to be hated by society. The point of your journey was mostly to be rejected by society, by force, in order to put you into that situation where we are completely isolated. So that
Exactly.
you can go into that state where you actually go in there without any psychedelics or any additional stimuli.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. But basically, can you basically tell us like what is the connection in your opinion between terrorism and criminality and occultism? Like what is relationship behind that in your mind, in your worldview?
Yeah. So it's kind of it's interesting because this is something that I've thought a lot about myself. What it comes down to is like there is a connection between the occult and terrorism because if you look at all these terrorist organizations, they often are filled with a lot of esotericists of varying degrees, whether they be Islamic in the Middle East, whether they be whatever strain of esotericism in the United States. Often they're some sort of left-hand path people, right? But what it comes down to is the modern world, technological society is very spiritually absent. We live in a society that is mostly focused on the material. It is focused on consumerism. It is focused on gratification of the senses and of material luxury and decadence, right? And these are things that are spiritual, that are just totally devoid of any spiritual principle. They're basically just animals, right? Most people seem to be just like the equivalent of cattle. There seems to be an absence of like spiritual significance in the modern world. And if you are in what Julius Evola would call of the aristocracy of the soul, where you know that there is more to existence, there's more to reality than meets the eye, the modern world can become very frustrating because no one else can really see it. I mean, we have our community here in the left-hand path who see it, but most people do not. and they actively ridicule it. And so this, and people who follow the esoteric and the left-hand path can often find themselves socially ostracized because their ideas are seen as hogwash by the modern world of science and materialism. And so there comes a degree of resentment if they don't know how to process their emotions properly, and it can manifest as hatred and misanthropy towards the modern world. And so this misanthropy is also very common in my tradition of the Order of Nine Angles. Most of the people of this strain, if you will, are very misanthropic. They're very angry. They're very hateful. They want the world to burn down. They're pissed, in other words, right? They just hate everything. And so I think that a lack of properly expressing these emotions through practice and ritual and whatever else you need to do to get them out can certainly lead to the misanthropic nihilism that's pretty common in these extremist groups, just a hatred for civilization and society due to the alienation. And so people who walk an occult path of a particularly sinister strain may find themselves wishing to cause chaos and havoc in civilization, and will hence join terrorist organizations because of just how decadent and repugnant they find civilization. I would say that's a connection for sure.
Okay. So, is there anything else you want to say for the end of this video, like to people?
Yeah. So I would want to say, quite frankly, that there's actually two things I want to say. The first thing is that wisdom, particularly of the left-hand path type, and occult knowledge cannot be found in the mainstream. You're not going to find it in these stupid fucking gurus. You're not going to find it in online shaman school, and you're not going to find it by following anybody else. Your path to enlightenment is going to be found within yourself, and you're going to have to journey to the fringes. It's just as physical as it is intellectual. You can't just read books. You can't just sit there on the internet and study all this shit. You have to practice in real life, and you have to journey to the edge, to the fringes, to find this occult wisdom. It's not going to be found in the sterile environment of modern society. You are going to have to explore the forbidden and the taboo and the truly sinister and dark in order to find the left-hand path enlightenment. It's not going to be on the internet. It's going to be out there in the world. And then the second thing I would say is that I would discourage people from doing what I did. Like, I walked a path of extremism and violence, and even though I got a lot of wisdom from it, I did realize that that whole like joining the Atomwaffen division and the neo-Nazi thing, like it wasn't necessary. Like, I really feel like I could have explored this path, the left-hand path, in a way that didn't end up in incarceration. And one of the consequences is that I'm watched by the FBI for the rest of my life, right? I see them following me everywhere. And so that really was just a consequence that wasn't worth it. So I would just say, if you do have this misanthropic anger, instead of joining an extremist organization, just try going out into the woods for like 100 days, maybe 6 months. Take a journey and put yourself in the isolation that you experienced, that I experienced, recreate these conditions and look inward and just get out of this place to find it, is what I would say. Anything you want to say?
So, like, basically, despite the fact that I personally didn't necessarily understood completely the first part of our conversation, like your joinement of terrorist organizations and shit, it's not like I have a bias against terrorism. Like, honestly, I don't care. I just didn't understood what was like the point of you joining the terrorist group, then convincing people to be against the group, then also participating in the actions of the group, then being arrested because you are in the group, it kind of
Yeah,
seemed though too chaotic and kind of redundant. Like it
yeah,
almost
yeah,
looked like you fought against yourself the entire time, like you were like beating
yeah.
yourself with yourself, with
Yes,
the aspect of yourself. So it was kind of messy. And then the real point of this came to fruition when you were in prison after a fight in solitary confinement for 90 days. And that was actually the point of everything. All before
yes,
that was pretty much you figuring out how to get into that state. And
exactly.
for the people who are kind of more mainstream, they will probably see you as a lunatic. I personally, as a host of this show, I don't care. Like many people would consider me a lunatic. I don't give a dime. I am simply glad that you and I kind of understood each other and we try to show people different way of seeing the world, as
Yeah.
controversial as it is, and that was basically the point of the show. So thank you, Cameron, for joining us and being there with us, and I'm really glad to have you here. Whenever you want to be on this show, just like hit me up. Or if you can give me like a list of 3 or 4 people you would like to see on the show, like associates of yours
Yeah.
who went through kind of similar path of being incarcerated, trial, and then solitary confinement, and then all kinds of things. And by the way, guys, just so you know, you need to like take care of your electric grids because if it blows up, you will probably drown in shit for 6 months. So unless you don't want that, please take care of your grids.
Yeah.
I am really baffled by how stupid people are to not protest because grids are so badly guarded and badly preserved. And
Yeah.
I think we are so stupid as a modern society that we actually don't need a nuclear war to die off. Like we will
Yeah.
probably die off because of something much dumber,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But I always like question limits of my own stupidity because myself
Yeah.
I can be exceptionally stupid. So I don't know, maybe I am contributing to this massive extinction by being so stupid that I am not aware. So thank you guys for watching and see you next time. And thank you, Cameron, once again for being here. Goodbye.